476 AD. A teenager named Romulus Augustulus is told to leave. Last emperor of the Western Roman Empire, man removing him didn't even bother to kill him. He is just sent home. A civilization that had run the world for 5 centuries ended by an administrative letter. For 1500 years, people have been arguing why. Here is what actually happened. This is not the simple version. Opposite of the story most people learned in school. The actual collapse layered, slow, and more recognizable than you might want it to be. Let's start somewhere unexpected. A plague. In 165 AD, Roman soldiers returning from the east brought something back with them that no general had ordered. Smallpox spread through the empire from one end to the other. It killed between 6 and 10 million people over 15 years. At its peak, Dio Cassius recorded 2,000 deaths a day in Rome alone. This was the Antonine Plague, and it arrived at the worst possible moment. The empire was already stretched across 3 million square miles. Its tax base depended on a functioning agricultural labor force across dozens of provinces. Its legions needed a constant supply of recruits from that same population. The plague removed all 3 pillars simultaneously. Fewer farmers meant food production dropped and grain prices spiked. Less taxpayers meant the treasury started running short before anyone admitted it. Less recruits meant the legions began filling gaps with mercenaries who had no particular loyalty to Rome. And then, 50 years later, the Plague of Cyprian hit, up to 5,000 deaths a day at its peak. The population that had barely recovered from the first plague was hit again. Subscribe if you think you know why Rome fell and want to find out how many things you were right about. The treasury problem is where it gets interesting, because Rome had a solution. It was a terrible solution, and everyone in charge knew it was terrible, but raising taxes to an honest level was politically catastrophic. So they debased the currency instead. Under Nero, the denarius was about 90% silver. By the time of Gallienus, 3 centuries later, it was about 5%. The rest was bronze with a thin silver wash that wore off almost immediately. Everyone could see what was happening. Merchants and soldiers demanded more coins for the same goods and wages. Prices across the empire rose. The government printed more debased coins to cover the gap, which made prices rise faster. By the 3rd century AD, the empire was experiencing inflation rates that would be recognizable to any economist today as a death spiral, and it did not stop there. To pay soldiers with increasingly worthless coins, the state started paying them in kind: food, equipment, land. But land came with obligations. Soldiers who received land stayed on it, which meant they were not soldiers anymore. The military that had conquered and held the ancient world was quietly rotting from the inside. Now add the political dimension, because this is where the story accelerates. Between 235 and 284 AD, during crisis of the 3rd century, Rome had at least 26 emperors, 26 in 50 years. Most of them were military commanders who had been proclaimed by their own armies after killing the previous emperor. None of them lasted long enough to fix anything. Each succession crisis drained the treasury further as new emperors bought the loyalty of their armies with payments they could not afford. Each civil war tore up the trade networks that Roman prosperity depended on. Merchants could not move goods safely. Farmers could not plan for a future that might not arrive. The system of interdependent provinces that made Rome rich began to fragment back into isolated local economies. Bryan Ward-Perkins, in his landmark book The Fall of Rome and the End of Civilization, traced this collapse in the archaeological record. He found that high-quality pottery essentially disappeared from the archaeological record of Western Europe after the 5th century. Tiled roofs vanished. Minted coins stopped circulating in many regions. The physical evidence was not transformation or adaptation. It was impoverishment. People in former Roman provinces went from living in a complex specialized economy to producing almost everything locally in smaller quantities at lower quality. Living standards collapsed in ways that took centuries to recover. The Eastern Empire survived because it was richer, more urbanized, more administratively coherent, and had shorter supply lines to defend. Constantinople became the new center of gravity. The Eastern Empire kept Roman law, Roman administration, and Roman identity for nearly another 1,000 years. The West was left to its own devices, and here is where Peter Heather's argument becomes important. Because Heather pushes back against the historians who describe the barbarian migrations as peaceful accommodation. His argument is this: the Huns appeared on Rome's northeastern frontier in the 370s. Their arrival set off a chain reaction. Germanic tribes that had been living in relative stability east of the Rhine and north of the Danube were suddenly displaced by a force they could not resist. The Visigoths, the Vandals, the Ostrogoths, these were not small raiding parties. They were entire peoples on the move. In 376, The Visigoths asked Rome for permission to cross the Danube and settle inside the empire. Rome agreed, but then mismanaged the settlement so badly that the Visigoths revolted. 2 years later, at the Battle of Adrianople in 378, a Roman army was destroyed. The Emperor Valens was killed on the battlefield. It was the worst military defeat Rome had suffered in over 7 centuries, and it was a defeat that came from inside the empire's own borders. The century that followed was a managed unraveling. Rome could no longer expel the barbarian groups. It could only try to incorporate them, pay them, flatter their leaders with Roman titles. It was an empire outsourcing its own defense to the people it could no longer stop. In 410, the Visigoths sacked Rome, the first time the city had fallen in 800 years. Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, recorded the shock of it. The city that had conquered the world had been conquered. People genuinely did not know what to think. They had been told and largely believed that Rome was eternal. 66 years later, Romulus Augustulus was handed the letter, and the answer to why it happened is not barbarians, or Christianity, or moral decay, or lead in the water pipes. The answer is that 5 things went wrong at once and fed each other. Plague reduced the population and the tax base. The treasury responded by destroying the currency. Destroyed currency produced inflation and military rot. Military rot and political chaos shredded the trade networks that kept the economy alive. And a destabilized frontier, under pressure from the Huns, finally produced a military challenge the weakened state could not meet. Each problem made the others worse. For 300 years. Gibbon started this conversation in 1776 and got some of it right, but he missed what Ward-Perkins confirmed in the archaeology and what Heather confirmed in the military history. This was not decline and transformation. It was collapse. A complex, interconnected civilization that had lifted the material standard of life across an entire continent came apart, and the people living through it experienced it as catastrophe. The roads still ran, for a while. The aqueducts still flowed, for a while. And then they did not, and the knowledge of how to maintain them went with the people who had carried it. The reason the story of Rome still matters is not because it is ancient. It is because every system that believes it is too big and too embedded to fail is running the same risk. Drop a comment. Which cause do you think mattered most? I genuinely want to know. Like, share, subscribe. 1500 years later and historians are still arguing. That says something about how complicated the answer actually is.